Service, I want to welcome you all out to Fort Sumter National Historical Park. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and so if at any point during this talk you feel like this ain't for you, feel free to walk away, go explore the fort. That's what you're here for. You've only got an hour out here, and I want to make sure that you use it your way. With that out of the way, though, in order to talk about where we are today, we have to understand why it's even here to begin with. And to do that, we've got to go all the way back to the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, the U.S. Army marched up into Canada and burned part of the city of Toronto. The British Army reciprocated by coming down into Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol and the White House. When the smoke had settled, the U.S. Army said, by golly, we ought to make it a whole lot harder for our enemies to do just that sort of thing. So they're going to create a commission to assess some of the holes in our harbor defense, and they'll propose a system of 42 brand new state-of-the-art forts be built to plug in some of those gaps. The third system of fortifications will include a line of forts starting all the way up in Maine, dotting the entire Atlantic seaboard, going down to Fort Jefferson and Dry Tortugas down in the Florida Keys. They'll build forts all the way across the Gulf, and as far away as a little place called Fort Alcatraz. Here in Charleston, an important city with a heavy concentration of wealth, we already had our own system of forts. We had Fort Johnson over on James Island, originally built in 1708, built by the British who were trying to keep out the Spanish. We've got Fort Moultrie over on Sullivan's Island, originally built in 1776 by the South Carolina colonials who were now trying to keep out the British Navy. And then we had that small fortification you passed on the way out here. That fortification's called Castle Pinckney. It was originally built in 1798 at the request of a guy named George Washington, and it was built as a last means of defense for the city of Charleston there. But this new commission, much like George Washington had, realized that we had Fort Johnson and Fort Moultrie protecting the entrance of Charleston Harbor. But those forts are much too far apart to stop enemy ships from coming in and attacking the city. If those forts had fired cannonballs at one another, they would have splashed harmlessly somewhere in the middle. And so what better place to build a new fort, right? The commission will find the most shallow place between Fort Johnson and Fort Moultrie, and that's right where they're going to build us Fort Sumter. Work would begin in 1829. Over 100,000 tons of granite would be shipped down here from New England, and boulder by boulder pushed over the sides of barges until they had built themselves an island. The next phase of construction would see the U.S. Army purchasing more than 3.8 million bricks. And it's important to note that all the bricks you see here today, except for the bricks that you walk on, were all handmade by the enslaved population right here on Charleston Plantation Brickyards. But the building of Fort Sumter itself, it was a government project, guys. They're going to run into numerous legal battles, money droughts, and delays. By the time they've made it to the year 1860, Fort Sumter was only about 75% complete. The walls were all the way up to their maximum height for all intents and purposes. It was a functional fort, but work was still ongoing, putting some of those finishing touches on interior structures, and more importantly, trying to get all of those cannon out here. While Fort Sumter was under construction, the U.S. Army garrison, a grand total of just 85 guys, under the command of Major Robert Anderson, were stationed over at Fort Moultrie, one of those older harbor forts with really low to the ground walls, and it was steadily falling into a state of disrepair. But as we know, 1860 was a very important year in our nation's history. It was a presidential election year. 4 guys running for the office, 3 of them support the institution of slavery.
Yan yun, oh. Yung window, because the window when it's open, you can really close it.
Major Anderson was group of 85 U.S. soldiers from an indefensible formal tree to a more defensible but as yet unfinished Fort Sumter. By February, 64 states had joined South Carolina in succession. Those now 7 states sent delegates down to Montgomery for the United Forum of the Confederate States of America. In that we inaugurated our president in March 4th, Abraham Lincoln officially finally becomes the new president of the United States. So in our timeline, now brought us to April. It's now April 1861, and Major Anderson here at Fort Sumter is running critically low on food and supplies. Lengthy negotiations, quite literally at gunpoint, are going to finally fail. So now we have General P.G.T. Beauregard. He's the man in charge of all of Charleston's defenses, and he is going to send a small delegation out here to Fort Sumter to let Major Anderson know that he is down to his last 1 hour to evacuate those U.S. troops out of Fort Sumter and out of Charleston Harbor. Major Anderson, though, is going to send that delegation away with the now famous words, "Gentlemen, you have your orders and I have mine. We're not fated to meet again in this life. May the Lord grant that we meet again in the next." And at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, 1861, a shot fired from Fort Johnson will rise up over Fort Sumter and explode, signaling all of those other Confederate positions around Charleston Harbor to open fire on Fort Sumter, officially beginning the American Civil War. After a barrage lasting 34 hours, Major Anderson is now out of food, out of ammunition, and Fort Sumter's on fire. Major Anderson is finally going to agree to those terms of evacuation, but not until he has accomplished one last thing. That is to execute a 100-gun salute to the American flag. Unfortunately, that's going to get cut short to a 50-gun salute, so the 47th shot and accident will occur. That accident will immediately kill Union Private Daniel Howe and mortally wound Union Private Edward Galway. Now, folks, on that day in mid-April, no one knew when or if the American flag would ever fly again over Fort Sumter, much less the rest of the American South. Likewise, nobody knew then, like we know now, that Private Daniel Howe would be the first death of over 700,000 that would occur in 4 years of war and devastation. Hindsight allows us the knowledge that Confederate troops, they too are going to eventually evacuate Fort Sumter and the rest of Charleston. They do that in February of 1865, and just 2 months later, the war would finally be over. Now, I want to thank you all for sticking with me. We have once again made it back to April. It's now April 14th, 1865, and now Major General retired Robert Anderson has been invited right back here to Fort Sumter for a grand reunification ceremony. With him, Major Anderson is going to bring the exact same flag that his troops had lowered over the fort exactly 4 years ago to the day. Now, y'all, that event should have been front page, headline news, every newspaper across the country. That event should have been the biggest event of the war to date. But most of us, we've never heard of that event. And that's because on that same day, on April 14th, 1865, just hours after Major Anderson had re-raised that American flag over Fort Sumter in a symbolic rejoining of our great nation, an exhausted President Lincoln took his life to Ford's Theater. And any good that he hoped to impart with that symbolic ceremony out here was ultimately overshadowed by his own assassination. As you walk around Fort Sumter today, we hope you don't just walk around here and view this as simply another historic ruin. We hope you can stand next to some of our historic bricks. Think about the enslaved man, woman, or child who made that brick, and know that that brick could very well be the only tangible thing left of someone's entire existence. the top of a concrete gun battery built in 1899. Think about what it was like to live or work at Fort Sumter even after the Civil War, as Fort Sumter would remain an active military fortification